Well, hello, my dear friends. I'm outside today. This is Bob Hatton. This is the Encourager. It's still raining, but I'm under a little roof at the moment, so I thought it would be a little bit better coming out into where there's more light. So we're starting our last week in this series, and I want to have a look at the leaders in Israel. So I'm jumping from we're around about chapter 8, chapter 9, something like that. And want to go to the end of the book to chapter 31. And in chapter 31, we see three leaders in Israel. We see the new one, the old one, the new one, and the best one. And today we'll just have a look at the old one, and the old one is, of course, Moses. And we can break his life up into three phases. Now, the interesting thing is that when we start chapter 31, in verse 2, Moses tells us that he is now old. He is 120 years old, and he is no longer able to lead this people. And we don't always have the ability to understand in which phase of life we are in. Sometimes when we're old and weak, we still think we can do more things. And when we're young and we're being challenged to move on, we feel that we're insufficient and so on. And it's quite difficult to understand which phase of life we're in. But I think Moses did that pretty well. So let's start with. We can break his life up into three different periods. And the first one is, of course, he was born in Egypt, but he was born to a Hebrew family, a family of slaves. And it was very dangerous for boys in those days because they were the Pharaoh, the king, he'd ordered them, newborn children, newborn boys, to be killed because he was trying to limit the size of the population. He didn't want them to grow to be too big so that they become a threat for him. So the parents of Moses' parents hid him away because he was beautiful. That was something special about him. They saw something special about him, and it came to a point where they no longer could hide him. He was probably getting a little bit bigger, making some more noise. So they decided to give him away. They put him in a basket. They put the basket in the river, and they commended him into God's hands. And of course his sister watched to see what was happening. And Pharaoh's daughter found him, and she took him in. She adopted him, and she looked after him. And Moses was brought up as though he was an Egyptian. He went to the best schools. He went to the best universities. He had a very, very good education. He was a person with influence, and there could have been something, very special develop from his life. However, his anger got the better of him in one incident when he's starting to realize he doesn't belong to these people. He speaks like an Egyptian, but he looks like a Hebrew. Probably he came into a little bit of a crisis, an identity crisis. Who am I? And he realized he came actually from the Hebrews, and he saw a slave taskmaster being very brutal to one of the Hebrew slaves. So when he corrected him, there was an argument, and Moses killed the taskmaster. His anger got the better of him, and he thought he'd done that in secret and nobody'd seen it, but it was seen. And so he had to flee from Egypt. He left Egypt, where he was really somebody of influence, somebody of great importance, someone who had a life of luxury and had a very good education. And he fled into the desert of Midian, and he joined a family of shepherds there. And he was 40 years old when he did that, and for another 40 years he lived in the desert of Midian. He learned how to be a shepherd. He learned the simple life of looking after sheep, and we get the impression that he was very conscientious with this job. He really liked doing it. He was a shepherd, and he thought, probably, this is now my life. This is how my life will end, in front of the herd of sheep that I'm looking after. And that was the second phase. And he's about 80, another 40 years have passed. And one day, out of the blue, without him having any expectation, he had a meeting with God. And this meeting came in the form of the burning bush, which is very, it's quite well known. And God gets a hold of him and he tells him he's got to go back to Egypt, because he's the man of the job. He can speak Egyptian. And not only that, he has a certain air and grace about him that he can approach the kings and he can approach the nobles without, going in there with a kind of Uriah Heep from Charles Dickens, humble stature. He goes in there as someone who feels that he can look the king in the eye and he can tell him what God has said, namely, let my people go that they might worship me in the wilderness. And he does that, and God is with him. And of course, we know the story that Pharaoh resists, but then Moses, God uses him in a supernatural way. 10 plagues come across Egypt, and in the end, Pharaoh lets him go, and he leads Israel out of Egypt, and they go through the Red Sea and into the desert. And actually they should have only been there for a short time, and then they should have entered the promised land. And by this time, by the time we're into chapter 31, Moses should have been able to build a little house, maybe at the seaside with a wonderful view of the Mediterranean Sea, sit on the patio on his in his rocking chair and enjoy the last years of his life. But it wasn't like that at all. Once he got into the desert, he found out that the people he was leading didn't like him very much, and he was always having disputes with them. They were very, very dissatisfied. They were complaining. They were moaning and groaning all the time. And we know this story. That's why God didn't let them in the end, and they had to wait till this new generation has come. And Moses knows he's not going into this new phase. There won't be a fourth phase. That his life will end at the end of phase number 3. So he's just getting them ready. In just a few days, maybe they will be entering the promised land. Moses will die, and he knows it. It's time for him to go. He doesn't have the ability to lead the people anymore. He's still quite fit. He doesn't have any glasses. His eyes are very sharp. After all this, he goes and climbs a mountain. He dies somewhere in the mountains. But he doesn't have the energy, he doesn't have maybe the intellectual ability to continue to lead these people. So that's why he gets another leader. But what a wonderful story this is. He really impacted the world history, and so many thousands of years later, we're still talking about him. And I don't know how many sermons I've preached about Moses or something about him. We're still talking about him today. Now, what I'm impressed of with Moses is that Moses, he got a hold of the job that God had given him at that moment. When he was in Egypt, he didn't really understand life at all, but he was in Egypt. But then when he went to Midian, he was satisfied just leading these sheep. But then God spoke to him, and he moved into the next phase of life. And I think he was hoping that he would enter the promised land, but at some point he realized it's not going to happen. And I meet some people, young people, and they feel so insecure or so insufficient. They don't want to get a hold of what God has given them for today. They think in a few years, when I'm a bit older, when I've got more talent, when my gifts have developed, then maybe I can do this, but not prepared to get a hold of what God has given them today. And then we have older people who are not prepared to leave go of all the stuff that they've been holding for so many years, because we're entering a new time. Now, one of the Bible verses that impacted me very, very much is a Bible verse that we find in chapter 9 and verse 10 in the book of Ecclesiastes. A strange book is that, but it says there, everything that your hand finds to do, do with your might. So everything that God puts at your feet today, get a hold of that. Don't say I'm too young, but don't say I'm too old. Don't say, you know, I've always done this, so I must continue to do this. Recognize the signs of the times in your own personal life and just follow God. Nobody can take anything away from you that God has given you. But when the time comes, let's just leave go of things and move into the next phase of our life. Well, I hope you have a good day. This is Bob Hatton. This is your encourager, and I'll see you again. Bye-bye.